It's really interesting because if you look at the UK dialogue at national policy level, you almost, people use the word resilience, but now it's all of society resilience. And we've often seen resilience as something that's being engineered and being imposed and implanted. It's not. And this is something I've said a lot, but if you look at resilience, all of society resilience, community-based resilience, action-orientated resilience, it's very much like getting fit. If your objective is, I want to become fitter, okay, it helps if you're fundamentally healthy. If you're fundamentally healthy, becoming fit is an option, and there's a pathway to that. But if you're fundamentally unfit for whatever reason, then you have other issues besides getting fit. If you're fundamentally unhealthy, then there's other issues besides getting fit. So if we want to have all of society resilience, I think one of the questions we can ask is our society fit? Is our society healthy? And in my opinion, our society is in the UK is fundamentally unhealthy for whatever reason. And therefore, it's very difficult to build resilience over that. And of course, the opposite end of that spectrum would be SISU, which is the Finnish concept of national societal resilience. And they feel very comfortable with that concept. They have a high level of trust in their government. They have a trust in their agencies. It is all inclusive. It is integrated, as you say. But we had a couple of programs on SISU, speaking with people from Finland. And somebody said something very interesting. He said, Finland is often identified as the happiest country in the world. It's not. We don't use that. Well, maybe it is, but we don't use that word. We don't ask the question, are you happy? We ask the question, are you content? And he says it's subtle, but it's different. Happiness comes and happiness goes depending on your whether you have a chocolate biscuit or not. But contentment feels, how do I feel in terms of me and the environment around me? And Finnish people are basically content. You know what? It's okay. It's more or less okay. It's pretty good, I suppose. That is contentment. And I think that we do not have that in the UK. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in Amjad, I'm going to bring in Andrew Blades, and then Emmanuel, we've got plenty of time. We're going to come back to you so we can touch points with you again. I'm sure there's plenty that you've got to think about and mention, and then we'll go around the table again. Okay, so Amjad, good to see you. Let's bring you in from Colombo.
Thanks, David. I'm actually currently in Kuala Lumpur for some work, and it's just fascinating to figure out that when we talk about cities, and Kuala Lumpur is one of those cities where it's ever expanding. But what I find actually, it's not even a city anymore, right? You have cities within the city. So I mean, I've been doing some work at Sunway University. For those of you who know, it's sort of in the southwest, and Sunway is in itself a microcosm of a city. It has its own kind of infrastructure, everything that is there. It's almost a self-contained city within Kuala Lumpur. So I think that as we move forward, this idea of, as you said, I think the design of cities has to be rethought. It's no longer just even a single entity. I think it will become these multiple entities. And I think David just who spoke previously was talking about the boroughs, and maybe you need to kind of boil it down to that local entity of what does that look like. And the other thing that I am sort of reflecting on, and I know particular colleagues who are in Europe are particularly struggling with the heat wave at the moment, right, is that these things are no longer unprecedented. And I know, David, you love to talk about the word unprecedented, and nothing's unprecedented anymore. And I think that we need to think about what does this mean now for the future of our existing cities, but how we design, how we reimagine. And this series is about reimagining what new cities could look like. What does that mean for the future? That you can't no longer think that a 40-degree heat wave in Western Europe is unprecedented. It's probably going to become the norm. What does that mean now for the consumption of air conditioning, of all of those things, and what does that then add to that perspective? And I think this is where you need to bring in different perspectives into this, and it's no longer just the planners who have a specific role to play. I think it's everyone has to be brought into this, and there needs to be the conversation. Just some initial thoughts there.
It's interesting, of course, the concept of wicked problems started out as a California planning issue in the 1970s, when sort of California the Los Angeles was expanding. And there were more and more cars there, so they built more and more roads, and the more and more roads you built, the more and more cars you had. And they couldn't seem to solve that problem. And from that came this idea of the whole concept of wicked problems. I think you're absolutely right about those cities within cities. For example, if you go up to Daman and you look at in Saudi Arabia and you look at where Saudi Aramco is, they have basically created a private-owned city. I mean, you never need to leave. You can be born there, grow up there, go to school there, go to university there, have hospital there, have your kids there. You never need to leave. And I think we have this almost dystopian. I looked it up. We have this idea of this dystopian cities. I need to quickly look it up. But I think it was in 1927, the first sort of dystopian film. I have a feeling there was one before that as well. I'm trying to remember it. But with this idea of the dystopian city, like Escape from New York or something like that, or Mad Max, the breakdown of the city as we know it into anarchy. I think that there's that feeling that we're not, it doesn't take too much to push us over. So I'm going to bring in Emmanuel. I'm going to bring in Andrew Blades. Emmanuel, I'll bring you in. And then I see we've got somebody in from Jakarta. I'm just trying to find that is. And then I'm going to bring you in because I was just in Jakarta last week. Let me just find out who that is. One moment. From Indonesia. So Festri Istiarani, if you are able to come in, I'd love to hear about Jakarta, because for me, Jakarta is a really interesting place in terms of trying to manage a city. There you are, Festri. I can got you on my screen, so we'll bring you in a minute. Okay, great. Andrew, to you, and then Emmanuel to you. Andrew, yours.
Hi, David. Thanks for that. And again, a really interesting discussion as always. As a social scientist, my first view of a city is the people. What are the people doing in it? How does the city support the way they live, and how are we designing systems to support people? So it's people come to this with very different lenses and very different approaches. What I would like to say is there's a tool called Most Significant Change for those of us who are qualitative researchers. We don't come from the quant background. There's a range of tools out there to work out what's changing, what's not changing. The problem with most significant change is it often tells you things you don't want to know. So you'll be asking about how good has the new bridge been, and people will explain to you how it's collapsed the local economy and causing domestic violence, which is not necessarily what you wanted the bridge to do, but that's most significant change really taps into how an event or an intervention affects a local community or the people that have experienced it. I think some of the comments you made there are really interesting, David, about drainage systems don't work. Again, my argument for a lot of this would be we know that those drains need to be cleared. Maybe they need to be cleared once a week, and then somebody says we can make this much smoother by only cleaning it once every 3 weeks. We can save some money in the process. So the system itself is designed for a certain set of parameters. When you start tweaking with those parameters, it doesn't work. Even when we look at natural systems that have evolved over time, they all work within certain parameters. It's this realization of what does that mean when we start to tweak the parameter. A colleague of mine is a dentist. He often says he loves it when people play squash or hockey because they come in with sore teeth. He said the real issue is they've done themselves a knee injury. It causes them to walk differently, gives them a jaw ache, and he can still bill them $180 for saying you need to go and see a physio. So fast patients, very, very good for his income. I think the final point that I would draw on is we're doing some research here, and a colleague of mine is leading this around the difference between the government-run resilience groups and those that are the community resilience groups. And we have found in a number of situations the government is of the opinion X is going to happen, and the community is of the opinion something totally different is going to happen. So I think about a couple of areas not far from where I live. We had really bad storms about 3 years ago. We were told it was going to take days to clear some of the smaller roads. Those roads were cleared within about 2 hours because everyone who lives locally has at least one chainsaw. I have three. I've got next door neighbours that have four. We've got tractors and bobcats. We just moved the stuff and the roads became open. There was no expectation that that would happen because the people who came up with these plans live in the middle of Melbourne, where not everybody has a chainsaw, and they certainly don't carry one in the back of their car on their way to work. So I think there's a big piece here about understanding communities will do are increasingly doing what they think they need to do because they're not sure they can rely on government to deliver the services as and when they need them. My final point would be just been to a food security seminar where people have decided that we're going to build over prime land because it's better economically, we reduce people's commute time, all those types of things, but we also massively push out how far the food bowls are from our cities. And that's now starting to cause us some other issues, carbon miles, those types of things. So with all of these, it's working out how those systems flow, the nested systems within them. I think Panarchy has a lot to offer. Thanks.
But you have absorbent cities. You have this concept now of having absorbent cities that absorb water. You start concreting stuff over, that then takes it away, and then that sort of means that water is not being run off. It builds up, and of course, anybody who's ever stood just knee deep in the ocean knows how powerful water is when it starts moving towards you. So it's that you talk about parameters, and of course, sort of in terms of conceptually, the opposite of something with parameters is something that is holistic. So rather than having specific parameters, you have something which is holistic. That's very simplistic, but it gives an idea of the tone. And then, of course, what you do is, and then what the government does, which is horrific, is they bring in KPIs, key performance indicators, which means you ask us, to look at something specific and you forget everything else. The idea of the community, well, as you know, Andrew, because we've had this conversation for years, the ISRM believes in community at the DNA. And our starting point is what FEMA, Center for Federal Emergency Management, said in New Orleans in 2005. After their absolute failure to respond to Hurricane Katrina. And they did a review of themselves and they said, we got it wrong. We thought that FEMA's job was to do crisis management. It is not. We do not do crisis management. What we should be doing is supporting communities that do crisis management. And as you said, there has to be that ownership because that's where the expertise is. And the retained understanding and knowledge and tribal memory is. And if the government can support that, that is where your ROI, return on investment, is, rather than having somebody in an agency spending 3 years to do an inquiry to build a plan which has absolutely no meaning and then takes 7 years to put in place at 16 times over cost, doesn't do what it says, whereas the people in the village actually knew what they needed to do about it. Emmanuel, we'll bring you in, and then there's other people I'd like to bring in. I'm going to bring in Festri, and then we'll see.
Right.
Anybody else who wants to come in, feel free. We'd love to have your voice. Somebody
Okay. Yeah, it's me. It's my background. No, sorry, David. This conversation has been indeed fascinating. I mean, there's something that stuck with me, something that you mentioned earlier, David. I like the examples with the COVID-19 restrictions and the Chernobyl ones. And I think that brings an interesting aspect here. And that is effectively that restrictions tend to work. We have the examples speaking about cities, of severe driving bans in Beijing, and they actually do improve air quality. And obviously restrictions can work. Enforcement then becomes an issue. How do you enforce that? And should you enforce that? And of course, speaking of, as you said, just now about communities being at the center, people actually don't want these restrictions. For example, in the UK, we have data on what the UK calls green natural spaces, and how post-COVID, actually, these are much more visited by people. But exactly these green natural spaces, especially when they exist within cities, they are the ones who actually provide all these different types of benefits and co-benefits that come from, increased sort of ability to absorb water, reducing temperature and so on. So I think, speaking of wicked problems, this conversation sort of reminded me of that again, that, there's potentially solutions or things that we can do, but especially in cities where you have all these people living in the same space and sharing spaces, whether some restrictions actually would happen, they would maybe have adverse effects on people who actually, benefit and need these, speaking of green natural spaces, more. So a restriction, you don't access a park, you allow for pollinators, to come in, and you have sort of plant growth and everything. But then these are exactly the same people who won't have access for all sorts of reasons in those areas. So this is just a reflection. I'm not necessarily making a point here. I'm just saying that it's just, the fact of these problems being wicked is just comes to you really fast. But it's still a fascinating conversation. Thank you.
Listen, we're going to come down to Festri, but I just want to talk who's in Indonesia and Jakarta. But I was involved in a 3-year program in Indonesia from 2020 to 2023 called Building Universities for Leading in Disaster Resilience. which was brilliant. 8 universities, trying to create those 8 universities as centers of excellence for disaster risk reduction. But parallel to that program, each university had 3 responsibilities. And the first responsibility was to move upwards and to help create better policy. So help universities to sort of help the local government, help community government, or help national state government create better policy. But the second point, Manolis, was they had to help create community-based ownership and engagement. And I think the problem with the situation described about people pushing back against restriction is those restrictions are created by somebody who is far, far away in a government agency who doesn't live there. And there is that feeling, you're in London or you're in Bangkok and you're whatever you might, and you're telling us that we cannot go into these fields, which is where we live and where we need to do. And I think that it really comes down to ownership. Amjad, who is now chair of our Sri Lankan chapter and is also deputy director of the Centre to Study Wicked Problems, spent a lot of his professional life doing global level community youth engagement and empowerment. And I think that is something that we've been looking at very powerfully. You've got to have community engagement and empowerment and ownership. You cannot impose this from central government directive. That is just a non-starter. Festri, great to have you here. Let's bring you in.
Okay, thank you, Mr. David Rubens. Thanks for letting me give the opinion about the Jakarta in specifically, but Indonesia as a general. As you know, you have been here last week, and you can see the skies Jakarta is like a gray, but not the cloudy. Unfortunately, there is a polluted air like air pollution. That we are facing it every day, and happily we still alive now, and we know that facing the same characteristic in a lot of city in Indonesia. They also have a bad air, and we know that a lot of environmental problem that we can describe as 100 pages, I think, because we have a lot of environmental expertise, but somehow government against us because they have a lot of we call it like they have their own opinion. So we just have some recommendation to get our cities getting better, but a lot of policy that government makes, but they can implement it as well because the capacity as a government staff is not matched with the implementation in their program. So as Indonesia, maybe same like the Indian problem, we facing a climate disaster risk. When the wet season, we facing a flood in almost in every cities in Indonesia is lost when we facing wet season, and we have a lack of water when we facing dry season, and there's more because our forestry is always also destroyed by the private sector, and they have permit from the government. So I cannot imagine how our cities can face when we talk about 2050. So I just can that's describe of my country, but in the bad way. But I hope that our generation, like my generation, is not stop to make a recommendation and make a better future with the program, and also give awareness to community to make our environment better in the future. That's all from me, David.
Festri,
Mr. David.
Thank you, Festri. Absolutely fascinating. I think you're again. It comes down to community. It comes down to ownership. It comes down to having people enabling their voices. There was something I was going to look up and I've lost it in my mind now. Gone. But what we do want to talk about is empowering the youth voice. I think that the youth voice is an incredibly significant part of what is happening here. Oh yes, the point I was going to make was with the point you made about Jakarta. Is that often now cities, the crisis is not an event, it is the lived experience. So, for example, heat at it is now in Dubai. It's 44 degrees at the moment. It's going, and it gets hotter. It's not even the hot season yet, But so you have in Bangladesh, you have floods. In East Africa, you have droughts. In Jakarta and in Delhi, you have pollution. You have smog. These are not events. This is the lived experience. And what we're seeing is on every basis, they're getting worse. So just let me quickly look at this. The Club of Rome, and in 1972, the Club of Rome gave 5 indicators for urban degeneration. So the environment was itself getting worse systemically. And then what they said was, at some stage, that will reach a tipping point and descend into catastrophic failure. So what are the 5 indicators? Increasing and accelerating industrialization. Well, certainly we saw that in the West 100 or 200 years ago, but we're seeing that in the great cities of the South. That is what is happening now, that increased industrialization. Rapid population growth, well, we can see that. Basically malnutrition, the growth of malnutrition, the fact that although you have massive riches, you also have increased malnutrition, that people are not having access to the nutrition that they need. The depletion of non-renewable resources, which we see, the forest, the water, the coal, etc., and finally, just the deteriorating environment. The environment itself is deteriorating, and all of those on every matrix are getting worse for a particular part of the population. What is really, really interesting is, if you look at the advanced North and West, we are seeing declining birth rates and in some places negative birth rates. Whereas in the South, we're seeing advanced population growth. And the 46 least developed countries, the 46 least, which will double their population by 2050. Why? Because they have high birth rates, but they also now have high birth survival. It used to be you had 10 children, but 8 died. Now you have 7 children, but 5 live. And so what happens is you have this demographic thing moving forward. So you have let me just do that. You have the 46 least developed countries will double their population, and 50% of the global population growth will come from 8 countries, which is Congo, Egypt, Ethiopia, India, Nigeria, Pakistan, Philippines, and Tanzania, all of which, of course, are the great nations of the South. And I think what we're seeing is we're going to be seeing more and more stresses put on things like water, we've discussed, on heat survival, because these are countries which are by themselves vulnerable countries. And then you put that growth on top of it, we're going to see stresses, which will then cascade out. What does that mean, and how do we engage with it? I'm supposed to know about this stuff. I have no idea. The answer is I have no idea. I have no idea. If anybody has an idea, please tell me, because I'm supposed to be helping government policy development. I don't know how to do this stuff. So if anybody has an idea, please let me know. I'd be interested to hear about that. Amos, good to see you, Amos. Let's bring you in. Tell us where you're coming in from and your thoughts, sir. And please, we have here people from all over the world with incredible experiences and insights. Please do share that, because we do record this. We'll write a report about this. Will be an ISRM paper that is now a record. We have dozens of these a month. That is a record of what we think the world is about in these incredible, chaotic and transitional times in 2026. This conversation, I believe, the record we have of it, will be historically significant in 10, 20, 30 years' time. I genuinely believe that. So please add your voice to the conversation. Amos, good to see you. Please come on in.
Thank you, Mr. Devi and team around. Actually, it's very insightful conservation and real. Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, good. You got it. Yeah.
Actually, it's good conversation for this, and I've been listening. Some productive. And what you are saying, Dave, is very true. And if you remember, just 2 years ago, here in Tanzania, we faced a very serious regarding the climatic change. But for one thing, I can say, like in Africa, especially in East Africa, for my country, Tanzania, actually we're still facing the problem of cities poor planning. That's why major problem you find we are facing a serious problem because of we are lacking something else. So in this conversation, I think Mr. David, I'll just find you separate because also I have someone I was requested. Actually, we need some help. Like you see, we have Ngorongoro National Crate. We are still getting these challenges of this climatical change. But you see, some years ago, the historical may be not found because of we are not carefree, and the people are not doing something what we need to reserve for the future.
Yeah.
Case comes.
Always been to this side.
Yeah, you have to go back round towards
Abby, I'm
the
going to mute you down, Abby. Okay. Amos, I want to talk to you about that, about the Ngorongoro crater, and I'll tell you why. Because in 1955, my father did the first survey of the Ngorongoro crater. He was he led the survey team. He'd been in the region with the British Army, and after the British Army he stayed. And so I have a feeling, and I can't remember any, but when we were growing up, when we were 4 or 5 years old, he used to speak to us in Swahili as well. I've forgotten it all.
Yep.
So if we came back and did something around Ngorongoro, then that would be completing my family history. 80 years later, 70 years later would be fascinating. Can I ask you very, very quickly, does Tanzania have a national policy structure framework which allows these issues to be discussed in an appropriate way, do you think?
Currently not, Dave.
Currently not. Okay, I think the truth of the matter is, if you ask me the same question about the UK, I'd say exactly the same answer. I'd say currently not. I'd say, Emmanuel, it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts. But when I hear the UK government talking about these policies, I think, sorry, we need to have grown-up conversations. And I'm just not hearing a grown-up conversation. I'm hearing empty, spacious policy statements which have no meaning at all and no backup.